If nothing new happened today, why does everything feel heavier? This is the moment after awareness hits, when clarity disappears, restlessness grows, and most people give up. Stay with this because this quiet phase decides what happens next. If you thought yesterday was supposed to bring clarity and instead today feels heavier, quieter, or more confusing, this is the part no one warned you about. Because the moment after awareness hits is rarely clean. It's rarely decisive, and it almost never feels like relief. Today doesn't come with a new event. Nothing new has shifted externally. And that's exactly why this moment feels unsettling. Most people expect awareness to work like a switch. Something clicks, something changes, and life moves forward. But real awareness doesn't work that way. It lingers, it presses, it asks you to sit with what you've seen before, it gives you anything new to hold on to. If you're here right now, listening, there's a good chance you woke up feeling slightly off. Not dramatically anxious, not clearly sad, just unsettled. Like something important surfaced yesterday, and today you're not sure what to do with it. This isn't coincidence, and it isn't a mistake. Welcome back to Prime Awareness. What you're experiencing today isn't a new shift. It's the after effect of one that already happened. Yesterday was the moment something loosened inside you. Today is the moment your system starts to notice the absence of what used to hold everything together. That absence can feel uncomfortable. You might feel more restless today than you did before. You might feel mentally tired without having done much. You might feel an urge to figure things out, mixed with a resistance to making any decisions at all. This is where many people assume something went wrong. They think, if that realization was real, I should feel clearer by now. Or, if I really understood something, I wouldn't feel this disoriented. But that assumption is backwards. Clarity doesn't come first, integration does. When awareness lands, it disrupts the internal structure you've been relying on, your habits, your justifications, your sense of direction. And once that structure is disrupted, your system doesn't immediately rebuild. First, it pauses. That pause is what you're in right now. The mind doesn't like it. The mind wants resolution. It wants to replace the old certainty with a new one as quickly as possible. But today isn't designed for replacement. It's designed for processing. This is why the feeling today can be harder to name than the feeling yesterday. Yesterday had a spark, a recognition, a moment of truth. Today has weight without a clear story attached to it. That weight isn't confusion, it's adjustment. Your nervous system is recalibrating around something you can't unsee anymore. And recalibration takes energy, it takes time. It often feels like fatigue, low grade tension, or a sense that you're moving through the day with less certainty than usual. Most people try to escape this phase. They distract themselves, they rush into decisions, they explain the feeling away so they don't have to sit with it. But this phase matters. Today is not asking you to understand anything. It's asking you to notice what thoughts keep resurfacing, to notice what feels heavier than it should, to notice where you're tempted to force clarity just to make the discomfort stop. Nothing is wrong because you don't have answers today. Nothing is broken because you don't feel resolved. This is the space where awareness becomes real, not as an idea, but as something your system has to learn how to live with. If you can stay with this moment without rushing past it, without turning it into a problem to solve, something subtle begins to happen. The noise starts to settle, not into clarity yet, but into honesty. And honesty is the real beginning. So if today feels quieter, heavier, or strangely unresolved, don't rush to label it. Don't push it away. This is not the end of the shift. This is where it starts to sink in. And if you stay with this all the way to the end, you'll understand why this day, more than the event itself, quietly determines what comes next. What you're sitting in right now isn't uncertainty for no reason. It's the natural phase that comes after awareness disrupts something familiar. Most people are never taught how awareness actually processes through the system. They assume insight should immediately translate into clarity, motivation, or direction. When that doesn't happen, they assume they misunderstood something or missed the point. But awareness doesn't move like information. It moves like a recalibration. When something true lands, the first thing it does is destabilize the structure that was built around what was no longer true. That structure can be a routine, a belief, a justification, or even a version of yourself you've been performing for a long time. Once that structure loosens, your system has to reorganize. And that reorganization happens quietly, internally, and often uncomfortably. This is why today feels different from yesterday. Yesterday was a moment of recognition, a spark, a sense of, I see something now. Today is what happens after the spark, when the nervous system has to adjust to living with that new information. The mind often resists this phase. It wants to close the gap as quickly as possible. It wants to replace the old certainty with a new one so it can feel stable again. That's why thoughts may feel more scattered today, not because you're confused, but because the old mental shortcuts no longer work. Shortcuts are efficient, but they're built on assumptions. And once an assumption collapses, the shortcut collapses with it. This is where many people mistake adjustment for confusion. You might notice that decisions feel harder to make, not because you suddenly lost your ability to choose, but because your internal reference point is being updated. The old criteria no longer feels reliable, and the new one hasn't fully formed yet. That in between space is not dysfunction, it's recalibration. You may also notice a drop in motivation, especially toward things that felt automatic. This doesn't mean you don't care anymore. It means your system is questioning whether those efforts still align with what you now recognize. Alignment always lags behind awareness. First, you see, then you adjust. Only later do you act. Another part of processing that rarely gets acknowledged is how physical it is. Awareness doesn't stay in the mind, it moves into the nervous system. That's why you may feel tired without exertion, tense without a clear cause, or emotionally muted without feeling depressed. Your system is conserving energy while it reorganizes. That conservation can feel like heaviness. Many people try to override this by pushing themselves to get back on track, but pushing during recalibration creates friction. It increases restlessness instead of resolving it because the system isn't ready to move forward yet. What's happening today is similar to adjusting your vision after a sudden change in lighting. At first, everything feels slightly off. Shapes are familiar, but not sharp. You can see, but not clearly enough to move with confidence. If you try to rush forward in that moment, you're more likely to misstep. This is why today isn't asking for interpretation or conclusions. It's asking for tolerance. Tolerance. Tolerance for not knowing. Tolerance for the absence of clarity. Tolerance for the pause itself. That pause isn't empty. It's active beneath the surface. Your system is reorganizing priorities, recalculating effort, and reassessing what deserves your energy. None of that happens consciously. It happens through sensation, repetition, and quiet observation. This is also why forcing meaning today feels exhausting. You're trying to extract answers from a process that hasn't finished integrating yet. You don't need to understand what's changing in order for the change to take place. You only need to stop interfering with it. When you allow this phase to unfold without pressure, something subtle begins to stabilize. Not clarity yet, but coherence. A sense that even without answers, you're no longer fighting yourself. And that coherence is what prepares you for the next stage, the one where awareness stops feeling heavy and starts feeling usable. But that comes later. For now, this phase has one purpose: to let the truth you've already recognized settle into the system that has to carry it forward. As that coherence slowly begins to form beneath the surface, it often reveals itself through very specific experiences that can feel personal, confusing, or even isolating if you don't recognize them for what they are. Today doesn't speak in conclusions, it speaks in signals. One of the first signs many people notice is a strange kind of mental friction. Decisions that once felt automatic now require effort. Choices you used to make quickly suddenly feel awkward, like your mind pauses before moving forward. You may find yourself revisiting options, not because you're uncertain, but because the internal logic you used to rely on no longer feels solid. This isn't indecision, it's the breakdown of an outdated framework. Your mind is recalibrating its criteria. It's no longer willing to default to old assumptions just to keep things moving. And until a new reference point forms, hesitation appears. That hesitation isn't weakness, it's discernment developing in real time. Another signal often shows up emotionally, but without a clear narrative attached to it. You might feel heavier than usual, less expressive, less reactive. Not sad, not anxious, just subdued. as if your emotional range narrowed slightly or your energy pulled inward. This can be unsettling, especially if you're used to understanding your feelings clearly. But what you're experiencing isn't emotional numbness, it's emotional digestion. When awareness reaches a deeper layer, emotions don't always rise to be felt. Sometimes they sink to be processed. The body takes over where the mind leaves off. That processing can feel like fatigue, quiet tension, or a sense that something important is happening internally, even though nothing is obvious on the outside. This is why rest doesn't always restore energy right now. Your system isn't tired from effort, it's occupied with integration. The third signal appears as a subtle internal conflict between urgency and restraint. Part of you feels an urge to act, to fix the discomfort, make a decision, or move forward just to relieve the pressure. At the same time, another part of you resists that impulse, feeling that acting too soon would be dishonest or premature. This tension can feel frustrating, especially if you're used to resolving discomfort quickly. But this is where something important is forming. You're learning how to remain present with awareness without immediately discharging it through action. That ability doesn't develop overnight. It emerges precisely in moments like this, where the impulse to move is met with an equally strong impulse to pause. Most people never develop this skill. They move too quickly and recreate familiar patterns, mistaking movement for progress. Today is teaching you how to stay with discomfort long enough for it to inform you, rather than rushing to silence it. Taken together, these signals aren't separate experiences. They're connected aspects of the same process. Mental friction shows you where old logic no longer applies. Emotional heaviness shows you where truth is settling beyond words. The tension between urgency and restraint shows you that your relationship with action is changing. None of this means something is wrong. It means something is reorganizing. The key is not to interpret these signals as problems to solve. They are messages about timing, alignment, and internal readiness. When you treat them as information rather than obstacles, they begin to guide you naturally. You don't need to force insight from them. You don't need to label them correctly. You don't need to act on them yet. Simply noticing these patterns, without judgment, without urgency, allows them to complete their work. This phase can feel subtle, but it's foundational. What's being built now isn't a decision or a plan. It's a more honest internal reference point, one that doesn't rely on habit or pressure, but on a deeper sense of alignment. And once that reference point stabilizes, clarity won't need to be forced. It will emerge as a byproduct of integration. For now, these signals are enough. They're telling you exactly where you are, not behind, not stuck, but in the middle of becoming more internally coherent than you were before. That's not something to rush past. Because this phase is quiet and unfamiliar, it's also the point where most people unknowingly work against themselves. Not intentionally, not because they're careless, but because they misunderstand what this moment is asking of them. The first mistake shows up as a need for immediate clarity. Once awareness has surfaced, the mind feels pressure to resolve it. You may catch yourself asking questions that feel urgent. What does this mean? What should I do next? What decision am I supposed to make now? That pressure can feel logical, even responsible. But clarity doesn't respond to demand, it responds to readiness. When you force answers before your system has finished integrating, you don't get truth, you get mental noise. You create explanations that soothe discomfort without actually reflecting what's real. Those explanations might feel convincing in the moment, but they rarely last. And when they fall apart, the confusion returns, stronger than before. This is why forcing clarity during integration often leaves people feeling like they're going in circles. It's not because they're incapable of insight, it's because insight is being rushed out of sequence. The second mistake is over-intellectualizing the experience. When something feels uncomfortable and undefined, the mind often tries to regain control by turning the experience into a problem to solve. You might analyze your emotions, revisit old conversations, consume information, or mentally rehearse different interpretations of what you're feeling. Thinking feels productive, it feels safe. But during this phase, thinking can become a form of avoidance. Awareness doesn't deepen through explanation, it deepens through presence. When you stay exclusively in your head, you bypass the part of the system that's actually doing the integration, the nervous system. You don't need to understand why something feels misaligned in order to respect that it does. Waiting for intellectual certainty can keep you stuck long after emotional clarity has already arrived. The third mistake is turning awareness into urgency. This is when insight gets mistaken for a call to immediate action. You might feel a sudden impulse to make changes, confront situations, or radically alter your routine just to release the internal tension. This kind of urgency often disguises itself as motivation, but it's usually anxiety in motion. Action taken before integration tends to recreate familiar patterns, even if the intention is different. You move quickly, but you move from the same internal framework that hasn't finished updating yet. That's why rushed changes often feel disappointing or misaligned after the fact. This moment isn't asking you to move faster, it's asking you to move more honestly. All three of these mistakes share the same root, a discomfort with not knowing. Perfectionism demands certainty before allowing feeling. Overthinking demands explanation before allowing presence. Urgency demands movement before allowing integration. But this phase isn't about control, it's about tolerance. Tolerance for ambiguity, tolerance for pause, tolerance for the absence of resolution. This doesn't mean doing nothing indefinitely. It means recognizing that timing matters, and that premature action can be just as misaligned as inaction. The skill being developed here is subtle, but essential. The ability to let awareness exist without immediately turning it into a task. Most people never practice this. They either suppress awareness or rush to discharge it. Both strategies prevent real integration. When you resist these traps, something shifts quietly. The pressure to decide softens. The need to explain relaxes. The urge to fix gives way to observation. You begin to trust that understanding will arrive when your system is ready to hold it, not when your mind demands it. This is not passivity, it's discernment. You're learning the difference between action that relieves discomfort and action that reflects alignment. That difference can only be felt when you allow this phase to complete itself. Nothing about this process is wasted. Nothing about this pause is accidental. If you can move through this day without forcing, explaining, or rushing, you protect the clarity that's still forming beneath the surface. And that protection matters more than speed, because what comes next doesn't need to be dramatic to be real. It just needs to be grounded. And that grounding begins here, in the restraint you practice when no one is watching and nothing is demanding a decision yet. When you resist the urge to force clarity, explain everything, or rush into action, something subtle but important begins to take shape beneath the surface. This day isn't here to conclude anything. It's here to prepare you. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that announces itself. Quietly. What's happening now is a settling of awareness into your internal rhythm. The intensity of recognition has passed, and what remains is something steadier, less emotional, less urgent, but more durable. This is the stage where awareness stops feeling like a disruption and starts becoming part of how you orient yourself. That's why today can feel almost uneventful on the outside. You may go through your routines, have conversations, complete tasks, and yet feel that something has subtly shifted in how you relate to all of it. The same structures are there, but you're no longer fully inside them the way you were before. This is not distance, it's perspective. Day 14 isn't asking you to decide where you're going next. It's making sure you're no longer standing where you used to be without realizing it. The old framework has loosened enough that you can't simply fall back into it unconsciously, but the new one hasn't solidified yet. That in-between space is intentional. It's what prevents you from repeating old patterns under a new name. As awareness integrates, it begins to refine your attention. You may notice that certain thoughts don't carry the same weight they used to. Certain pressures feel less convincing. Certain obligations start to feel negotiable, even if you're not ready to renegotiate them yet. Nothing has been removed from your life today, but something has been reprioritized internally. This is what preparation looks like when it's done properly. Instead of pushing you toward immediate change, this day slows your internal pace just enough to let truth settle without distortion. It allows your nervous system to adjust before you're asked to respond differently. It creates a buffer between insight and action, a buffer that protects the integrity of both. You don't need to do anything with this yet. You don't need to name what's changing. You don't need to explain it to yourself or anyone else. What matters is that you're no longer forcing yourself to ignore what you've noticed. That alone shifts the trajectory. In the coming days, clarity will begin to emerge, not as a sudden realization, but as a quieter confidence. Decisions will start to feel less strained. Direction will feel less theoretical. You won't have more answers all at once, but you'll trust the ones that arrive. And that trust doesn't come from thinking harder. It comes from allowing this phase to complete itself. This is why today matters more than it seems. Most people rush past this stage because it doesn't feel productive. There's nothing to show for it, no visible progress, no clear outcome. But this is the stage that determines whether future movement will be aligned or reactive. When you let awareness settle instead of chasing resolution, you give yourself a different kind of stability, one that isn't dependent on certainty or control. You begin to move from a place of internal coherence rather than external pressure. That doesn't mean life suddenly becomes easy. It means it becomes more honest. Day 14 doesn't close a chapter. It prepares the ground. It ensures that whatever comes next won't be built on denial, distraction, or urgency. It makes sure that when action eventually does happen, it's informed by something deeper than habit. So if today feels quieter than you expected, let it be quiet. If it feels slower, let it slow. Nothing is being delayed, nothing is being lost. This pause is not an interruption in the process. It is the process. And when the next phase begins, you won't need to force yourself to recognize it. You'll feel it, not as pressure, but as readiness. That's how you'll know this day did exactly what it was meant to do. What this day ultimately offers is not a message to interpret, but a state to recognize. Day 14 exists to remind you that awareness doesn't arrive to be solved. It arrives to be lived with. Nothing dramatic is required of you here. No conclusions need to be reached. No identity needs to be rewritten. What matters is that something true has already been seen, and your system is learning how to hold it without rushing past it. This is the quiet work most people skip, not because it's unimportant, but because it doesn't reward impatience. Day 14 slows the internal pace just enough for honesty to settle in without being distorted by urgency or fear. It teaches you that clarity is not the starting point of change, but the result of integration. When you stop forcing answers, your attention becomes cleaner. When you stop overriding discomfort, your inner signals become easier to trust. This day doesn't push your life forward on the outside. It stabilizes the ground beneath it on the inside. And that stabilization quietly determines whether the next step you take will be reactive or truly aligned. The deeper lesson is this: not every meaningful shift requires action. Some require restraint. Some require patience. Some require allowing discomfort to exist long enough to teach you something. To apply this in daily life, practice pausing when you feel the urge to rush clarity. Notice when you want to fix a feeling instead of listening to it. Give yourself permission to not decide yet. Over time, this builds a powerful form of self-trust, the kind that doesn't depend on certainty, but on an honest relationship with your own awareness.